Bringing in right now Russell Moore. He's the editor-in-chief at Christianity Today and leads its public theology project. He's an author of a new piece for The Atlantic titled "Trump's Lie is Another Test for Christian America."
And Russell, on your new piece, you write in part, quote, "When we are willing to see children terrorized rather than stop telling lies about their families, we should step back, forget about our dogs and cats for a moment, and ask who abducted our consciences." That's especially true for those of us who, like me, claim to be followers of Jesus of Nazareth, who told us that on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word they speak. To sing praise songs in a church service while trafficking in the bearing of false witness against people who fled for their life, who seek to rebuild a life for their children after crushing poverty and persecution, is more than just cognitive dissonance. Christians do not need to struggle to figure out what Jesus would do here. If we see children sheltering at home because they fear violence, we know that's wrong. And when we see that this fear comes from the incitement of hatred against those children because of where their parents came from, surely we can smell the brimstone.
And Russell, just for people watching who would say, "Oh, well, that's just some lefty." You, like me, grew up in the Baptist church. You, like me, I'm not going to, I'll just say, I've been against illegal immigration my entire life. I think we need strong borders. I think we need to always secure those borders. And at the same time, we need to do what we can do, like you said, to show love, mercy, and grace as we go through the process. But here, Russell, the lies are about people who are here legally, people who are working hard, people whose bosses are saying they work harder than anybody that we can get to work in Springfield, and here legally, working hard, pursuing the American dream. They and their children are in hiding now because of bomb threats and because of hatred and lies spewed by a ticket that's running to be president and vice president of the United States. Hey, what's Christ like about that?
Well, this is part of the moral sickness that we see around us right now. I think there's some good news on the ground in Springfield. Christianity Today did a report from Springfield about what churches and pastors are doing. There's not the kind of demonizing of Haitian migrants there locally, but it's coming in from all on the outside, and it's coming in all over social media. This is going to get people hurt. We have children who are sheltering in place, scared. This isn't just cat memes. And that's right. Part of what's so alarming right now is we act as though we're just, it doesn't matter if we lie our way to the truth, if we just bear false witness against people, claim that they're abducting pets, using every kind of stereotype and demonization of people from other places. It's morally sick and morally wrong.
As an evangelical Christian who actually believes in the existence of Satan, you write, I agree that we can see the work of the devil at play here. Only it's not on the menu of the Haitian families, but rather in the cruelty of those who are willing to lie about them. And Russell, my friend, you have said it, and I've always brought up the story of the Good Samaritan, and because this hatred of all people who do not look like us, who do not think like us, who do not worship like us, it is the antithesis of what Jesus said. And you're the theologian, but I'm going to just quickly say for those watching that haven't read the Bible, specifically those who claim to be evangelicals, Jesus is specifically asked when he has said we must love our neighbors as ourselves. He is specifically asked, who is our neighbor? And that's when he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. The Samaritan who was hated and loathed and despised by those Jesus was talking to, and yet talked about the Good Samaritan doing what religious leaders would not do, and that is provide comfort and grace for the man on the side of the road who had been beaten.
Yeah, and I often think about what Martin Luther King said about that very story of the Samaritan. The priest and the religious leader who passed by probably weren't doing that out of apathy, he said. They were probably doing that out of fear. They probably thought, if someone's beaten up, there are probably robbers around here, I might be hurt next. And so that kind of fear leads to the mistreatment of this vulnerable person. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. There are people who, as some would say, conflict entrepreneurs, who want to cause us to be afraid of our neighbors. It's happened over and over again. It happened with Italian immigrants, with Irish immigrants, with Vietnamese refugees, with others, to say you should be afraid of these people and therefore you should mistreat them and you shouldn't care what happens to their children. And even beyond that, what happens to our own consciences and our own souls. That's a dangerous place to be. And we have to, the Bible says perfect love casts out fear, and we have to be freed from this kind of fear.
So, Russell, I'm curious where you stand on this, because obviously it's really important not to judge others, cast judgment. At the same time, it seems like there is absolutely nothing Christ-like about what Trump and Vance are doing, especially to Haitian migrants in Springfield. What do you say to evangelical Christians who support Trump and Vance, especially in this? Are they choosing to be blind to the destruction and to the danger that they are posing to these people? Or are they still in a category where you have to completely withhold judgment and assume that they are doing the best they can? They just don't know.
Well, I think there are some people who are confused by the kind of misinformation and disinformation that rockets around the place right now. And for those people, we need to simply talk about what's actually happening and how these words can be dangerous. But I'm less worried about the political ramifications of this than I am this ongoing cycle of demonizing one group after the other. That just can't keep going like this. We can't keep living like this as a society. Something's got to give.
Pastor Moore, Elise Jordan here. You earlier were speaking about bearing false witness and the troubles that come from that sin. But it used to be in politics that politicians on both sides, they were, there was somewhat of a norm that you didn't bear false witness against your opposition, and it was seen as unchristian-like behavior. And how are we seeing that norm erode?
Well, politicians have always lied, but there usually was a more careful dancing around the lie. What's different about right now is this attitude that happens of saying, maybe it wasn't true, but the larger meaning behind it is true. Or maybe this doesn't actually apply here, but it does apply to the situation at the border. Well, that's lying. And it's not just lying, it's lying about a group of people, and a group of people who are especially defenseless right now in a new country, escaping horrible, horrible situations. It's hard to find much lower than that.
I remember, Russell, in the days after Katrina, going over to Mississippi and Louisiana and seeing evangelical groups on the ground immediately. I remember Pat Robertson's group immediately on the ground, other church groups immediately on the ground. And so that's why I think it's very important, and again, for people that are watching that may get all of their news and information about evangelicals off of Twitter or from what politicians say, and the twisting and the perverting of the term evangelical to such a point that you even had Tim Keller saying before he died, "I don't call myself an evangelical." That's a political identifier, has nothing to do with faith. But I want you to talk about what you started with. Evangelicals, and I believe Southern Baptists, on the ground in Springfield, Ohio, acting Christ-like, embracing these people who are the most vulnerable and reaching out and trying to help them.
Yes, you have church groups and Christians caring for, looking out for their Haitian neighbors, and also saying to the outside world, stop lying about our neighbors, whether they're Christians or not. They're people, and we love them. Those are the people, though, that usually aren't on Twitter or on Facebook spreading memes in the opposite direction. They're people who are just doing the work. And those are the people I think that our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren to come and the generations before us really need to see. But they're very they're kind of invisible right now.
The new piece is available to read online at theatlantic.com. Editor-in-Chief of Christianity Today, Russell Moore, thank you very much for coming on the show this morning.